Here is the chassis removed from my Zenith 1951 Giant Circle Cobramatic console. I figure that it's about time that I pull this out and look into recapping and replacing low or out of spec resistors in the chassis to try to get this thing working again. Now the first thing I need to do is I need to pull the CRT off of the chassis. It's basically, in this condition, it's basically resting. This is an insulator. It's resting on a stand down there, so I have to pull it out of the yoke and set it aside. I've never done that on a set like this, so I hope I can do it without exploding the tube. But that's the first thing I'm going to do, is to pull that tube out of there so that I can upend the chassis and take a look underneath and start planning my my recapping and everything on this chassis. Have the CRT out of it. I've replaced picture tubes in TVs several times in my years when I had a shop, and I worked for someone as well. And I have to say that that is absolutely the lightest picture tube I've ever lifted. I didn't realize how light it was. I kind of thought it was when I pulled the chassis out. It just seemed like the chassis should have been heavier feeling than it was. But that CRT is quite lightweight. Now I did mark it just so I have some reference points. I put this here, and this shows where the ion magnet goes. I have a mark on the magnet that corresponds to that, so that when I get it back together I could at least get it close to where it was, if not exactly. Anyways, now that the CRT is out, and I'm gonna put the CRT probably in the cabinet just to get it out of the way so it doesn't get damaged. That's an RCA tube. It's not, doesn't have a Zenith label on it. It's RCA. So I expect it's a replacement. If you remember right, when I tested it in one of the earlier videos on this television, it tested quite high, actually remarkably high in emissions. So I would say that that is not the original tube. That's a 19 AP4, but it's been a replacement. I could be wrong, but you know, you guys who have worked on more of these sets than I have would know more than I would. But my suspicions is that is a replacement tube. So the CRT is safely stowed away back in the cabinet, sitting on a nice cushion in there, so it's all safe. You'll notice that these tubes are pretty shiny. Well, if you remember right, if you saw my video before this one, I tested all of these. Are all related to the horizontal sweep circuits. And there was no high voltage, no picture obviously, no high voltage, no nothing. And that was only a test just to see what does work and what doesn't work in this set. One thing I do know is the set does receive. It actually does receive. I got, it was noisy, but it actually worked enough to where I could receive my channel 3 transmitting channel into it. So I know that. Here's an issue. Here's the 6BQ6 horizontal output tubes. Now I had both of these tubes out and tested them, and they were absolutely fine. But this one, the cap came loose when I put it back in. So I have to deal with that. I hope I don't have to replace it. You also notice that it's leaning in a little bit. That's because the rivet that holds the socket in place, the rivet is broken. So I'll have to fix that. But there's many things to be fixed in this set. One of the things I need to do is I need to verify that the flyback is still good. I used to have a flyback ringer. It was a Sencor something 60. I can't think of the model number, but when I had my business in the late 80s, I sold all that test equipment when I sold the business. So there it went. But anyhow, I'll have to see if I can get a flyback ringer or at least test the DC ohms. I think it's listed in the ohms that the winding should have in the SAMs folder I have. Anyhow, now I can tip this set up on its side and take a look at the capacitors. It's already a given that they're all going to be replaced, with maybe the exception of the mica caps. And I'll deal with this tube, try to fix it. I think just a little bit of resoldering and some super glue will fix that cap, hopefully. And check resistors. So I'm going to upend this chassis pretty soon just to take a look at it underneath. I haven't even looked at it at the underside of it yet. So here's the underside of the set. It's loaded with those notorious bumblebee capacitors that will need to be replaced. This looks like a replacement by a tech at some point or another. It doesn't match what's in here. Here's another one in here. I don't know, that one may be original, but these bumblebee capacitors, as I've been learning from other YouTubers, and I have rarely ever worked on sets this old. I've never restored this television is actually my first attempt at restoring a vintage television to operation. Here's a spider that will come to an end in its life quite shortly. What a shame. Lots of power resistors to check. So I'm going to try to at least determine if the flyback is good. I'm not quite sure what I want to do. I could let that go and do all these capacitors first, because I would say that the CRT being so good and everything else on the set having been worked on, I got the Cobramatic and the at least the FM part of the radio working. I still have to deal with the AM. I think I have an IF problem that has to be fixed, but it's moving along. I'm getting somewhere with it. That's the main thing. So this is where we're at with this. I think the next video will be when I've got all of these components replaced. I'm going to have to get a test jig rigged up. I'm not going to pop the CRT back in and test it with the actual CRT to find a test tube. I do have a test tube, except the socket or the plug came off of it. So I can see if I can find the plug. It's got to be in my collection of junk downstairs. I think it'd be easier to just buy a test jig for it, or at least to find a test CRT and use that to test it. Anyhow, I guess that's going to be it for now. And I'll be making another video as soon as I got all of these parts replaced, and I'm in the phase of getting close to testing it.